Dr. Arifa Khan woke up before the sun rose in the city that never slept and looked out of the small window of her rented apartment to see the streets empty and silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She ran her hands through her hair and felt the exhaustion of the previous night weighing heavily on her shoulders. The emergency calls had not stopped. The patients kept coming, and the hospital halls were filled with the sound of monitors and the cries of those who were suffering. She had chosen this profession to save lives, to make a difference, and now the challenge had become larger than anything she could have imagined. The pandemic was spreading faster than any news report could capture, and every night she lay awake wondering how many would not make it to see the morning. The thought of her own family made her chest tighten. She had stayed away from them for weeks, refusing to risk bringing the virus into their home. She spoke to her mother only over video calls, and each time she saw the worry in her mother's eyes, she wanted to cry, but she forced herself to smile and tell them she was fine, because she could not allow herself to break yet. She was breaking inside. She dressed quickly in her scrubs and put on the mask that had become like a second skin to her. She carried her bag that held the few things she needed and left the apartment that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. The city was eerily quiet, and the few people she passed on the street kept their distance, as if they were afraid of even breathing near her. She reached the hospital, and the security guard gave her a nod that was full of both respect and pity. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the emergency floor. The ride up felt like an eternity. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest, and as the doors opened, she was immediately met with the chaos she had grown used to. The monitors beeped endlessly, nurses ran back and forth carrying trays of medicines and oxygen masks, and doctors shouted instructions over the noise. Her own team looked exhausted but determined, and she felt a pang of pride mixed with sadness for them. She moved from bed to bed, checking vitals, giving instructions, adjusting treatments, and holding hands with patients who could no longer see their families. She became the bridge between the world inside the hospital and the world outside, and every life she touched was a reminder that she had chosen this path, knowing it would demand everything from her. She did not eat or drink. She did not sit. She did not rest. She only worked and kept working. Hours blurred together as she moved from one patient to another. The faces became a blur, but each one had a story, a family, a history, a life that mattered to her. She recorded every symptom, every change, every response to medications, and sometimes she whispered small words of encouragement, hoping that her voice could give some comfort. She walked to the corner where the ventilators hissed and sighed, and she checked the machines, making small adjustments as needed, and the nurse next to her nodded in appreciation. She felt a momentary relief that her team was holding up, but she knew the storm was far from over. During a brief break, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a second. The second stretched into a minute, and her mind wandered to her father who had called that morning asking her when she would come home. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she might not be coming home for weeks, if not months. But she smiled and told him everything was fine and that she was taking care of herself. She hid the guilt and the pain because she had no choice. She had to be strong. She had to be the pillar for everyone around her. The hours passed, and the number of patients continued to rise. She felt her hands trembling, but she kept going because there was no one else who could do this, no one else who could save the lives that depended on her. She saw a young man coughing violently and struggling to breathe, and she rushed to him, adjusting his oxygen mask and giving instructions to the nurse. She saw fear in his eyes, and she held his hand, telling him it would be okay, even when she herself was not sure it would be. She moved to the next patient, an elderly woman who could barely lift her head. She spoke to her softly, asking her to stay strong, to fight, to remember that she was not alone. She moved through the rooms like a ghost who carried both hope and despair in equal measure. She felt herself growing weaker with each hour, yet she could not stop because stopping meant giving up, and giving up was not an option. Even when she felt the tears threatening to spill, she swallowed them and focused on the tasks at hand. She helped deliver a baby whose mother was struggling to breathe. The newborn cried, and for a moment, the sound was a beacon of hope in the otherwise grim reality. She wrapped the baby carefully and handed the child to the mother's partner and watched as they held the tiny life in their hands, and she felt a spark of warmth in her chest that reminded her why she had chosen this path. She continued through the night, answering calls, checking charts, comforting patients, and coordinating with other doctors. Every moment was a battle against exhaustion, fear, and the unknown. She thought of her family again and wondered if they understood how much she was sacrificing. She wondered if she would see them soon, if the world would ever return to normal, if she herself would ever feel safe again. The sun began to rise, and the city outside her window slowly came back to life. She looked at the clock and realized she had been awake for nearly 36 hours. She felt her knees weak, but she did not sit, she did not rest, she only continued, because there were still people who needed her, still lives that depended on her. And in that quiet moment between night and day, she made a silent promise to herself that no matter what happened, she would keep going. She would not let fear or exhaustion or grief stop her. She would be there for every patient, every family, every life that came into her care, because that was who she was, a doctor, and this was her calling. Dr. Arifa Khan moved through the hospital corridors like a shadow of herself, her scrubs soaked with sweat and her mask leaving marks on her face. She had not slept in days, and the endless ringing of phones and monitors had become a constant background noise that never left her. She had begun to feel the weight of every life that slipped through her fingers. The faces of patients who had died haunted her, even as she moved to help the next. The pandemic had changed everything, and the city outside seemed like a different world, a world that had forgotten what normal meant. She received a call on her phone from the hospital administration. She answered quickly, expecting another emergency, but instead she heard the trembling voice of her mother telling her that her father had tested positive for the virus. Arifa felt a chill run through her body. Her hands shook as she gripped the phone. She wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. She wanted to leave the hospital and run to her family, but she knew she could not. She was needed here. Every patient in the hospital was relying on her knowledge, her hands, her strength. She promised her mother she would find a way to help her father. She told her to stay strong and to follow the doctor's instructions, and she tried to sound calm even though her own heart was breaking. She returned to her rounds, moving from room to room, checking vitals, adjusting medications, comforting patients, and giving instructions to the exhausted nurses. She could feel the fog of exhaustion settling over her mind, yet she pushed herself harder because there was no time to feel weakness. There was only work and survival. The days blurred together and the number of patients kept increasing. She held the hands of the dying, whispered words of hope to the fearful, and offered strength to the families who could not be with their loved ones. She saw faces that reminded her of her own family, and she could not stop the tears from threatening to fall. She wiped them quickly and moved on because in that moment, any hesitation could cost a life. She received another call late at night, her heart sinking as she listened to the news. Her father had deteriorated rapidly despite the best care he could get at the hospital near their home. She could not be there to hold his hand. She could not see him one last time, and the realization tore at her insides. She held onto her phone as her mother sobbed on the other end, and she tried to comfort her, telling her that everything would be okay, even when she knew it would not be. She felt guilt wash over her like a tidal wave for choosing to stay here for the patients here, for the city, while her own family suffered. She moved through the hospital like a machine, her mind numb, her body screaming for rest. She gave injections, started IVs, checked oxygen levels, and coordinated with the doctors around her. She watched the young nurse beside her collapse from exhaustion, and she grabbed her shoulders, steadying her, telling her to take a breath, to keep going, because there was still work to do. She herself did not pause. She did not stop. She felt the weight of responsibility on every shoulder in the hospital, and it pressed down on her like a mountain. She went to the corner where the patients most critically ill were kept, and she adjusted monitors, gave medications, and whispered words of encouragement. She felt powerless at times when she could not save a life, and it made her question everything she had chosen. The world seemed cruel and indifferent, yet she continued. She could not allow despair to take hold. She received another call days later. Her mother was admitted to the same hospital her father had been taken to. She rushed to see her mother, who looked pale and fragile. The thought of losing both parents crushed her heart, but she swallowed the pain and focused on the tasks at hand. She held her mother's hand, guided the doctors, gave instructions, and stayed by her side for hours on end. She slept in the hospital corridors on a small cot left for staff. She barely ate, and when she did, it was cold food eaten in minutes. She felt her own body weakening, yet she ignored it because there were still lives that depended on her, still people who needed her. She thought about quitting, about going home, about stopping, but she knew that doing so would mean abandoning the very reason she had chosen to become a doctor. She had nothing left for herself. No energy, no time, no comfort, no sleep. Only the patience and the unrelenting rhythm of the hospital. She witnessed more deaths than she could count, families crying in hallways, patients gasping for breath, young children clinging to life in ways that were impossible to watch, and she held them through it all, offering what she could, even if it felt meaningless in those moments. She was everything for everyone and nothing for herself. The pandemic had taken everything from her, yet she clung to the hope that maybe she could save someone. Maybe she could make a difference. Maybe she could prevent the heartbreak from touching someone else. She spent nights alone in the empty break rooms, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would survive this, if her heart could bear the weight of so much loss. She thought about the future. She wondered if the world would ever be normal again, if she would ever be able to see her family without fear, if she would ever feel safe in her own skin. She helped deliver a child whose mother was on the brink of death, and she watched the tiny life cry for the first time. The joy was fleeting, but it reminded her why she endured, why she sacrificed, why she kept moving forward despite everything she had lost. She was losing herself slowly, yet she refused to give up because giving up was not an option, not for the patients, not for the families, not for the city that relied on her. She was becoming a symbol of strength, a force of nature in the midst of despair, and yet, inside, she felt hollow, empty, and exhausted. She walked to the window for a brief moment and saw the sun rise over the city streets. She felt tears streaming down her face. She had lost so much, yet she had not lost the will to keep going. She promised herself silently that she would survive the storm, that she would keep moving forward, that she would continue to fight for every life that came into her care, even when the world seemed to have forgotten her. She would not forget herself. She would not forget why she had chosen this path, and she would continue to walk through the darkness even when it threatened to swallow her whole, because that was who she was, a doctor, a healer, and a fighter. Dr. Arifa Khan walked through the silent corridors of the hospital, her steps heavy, her body aching, her mind screaming for rest. Yet she could not stop. There were still patients who needed her hands. Her eyes scanned the monitors and charts, each beep and blip a reminder of lives hanging by a thread. She had lost track of how many days had passed. She could not remember the last time she had slept or eaten properly. The smell of antiseptic and medicine had become permanent in her clothes, in her hair, in her skin. She received a call from her mother, and her heart sank. Her voice was weak, trembling, telling her that she was struggling to breathe, that the hospital could do only so much, and that she missed her father. Every word was a dagger in Arifa's chest. She wanted to run to them. She wanted to hold their hands, tell them she loved them, but she could not. She had patients who could die without her intervention, and she forced herself to take a deep breath to steady the shaking of her hands. She moved from room to room, treating patients, checking vitals, administering medication, explaining procedures, calming terrified families. She was everywhere and nowhere at once. A pillar holding the lives of dozens of strangers together while her own world crumbled around her. She returned to her small apartment for the first time in weeks to gather some personal belongings, only to find that the rent had lapsed and the locks had been changed. She pounded on the door, begging for understanding, telling them she was a doctor working through a pandemic, but there was no mercy. She had no home to return to, no warm bed to lie in, no quiet corner to rest her aching body. She spent the night sitting on the steps outside, feeling the cold seep into her bones, feeling utterly alone. The hospital became both her sanctuary and her prison. She moved through the halls, delivering oxygen, adjusting medications, performing procedures, answering questions to families who could not see their loved ones. She held hands, she whispered words of encouragement, she offered herself as a bridge between life and death. Yet, inside, she felt empty, hollow, and on the verge of breaking. She received news that her father had passed. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to keep moving because there were patients who could not wait for her grief. She could not pause to cry or scream or mourn. She had to continue saving lives even when the part of her that felt human was shattered. Her mother's condition worsened, and Arifa took over her care in the hospital, moving between patients and her mother, making impossible choices, deciding who would get attention, who would get medication, who would get her time. She felt guilt with every breath, knowing she could not do enough. She watched the hospital transform into a place of constant crisis, staff collapsing from exhaustion, families crying in hallways, patients gasping for air. And she moved like a ghost among them, silently carrying the weight of every life she could not save. She fell asleep standing once, holding a patient's hand until a nurse gently guided her to a chair. She barely noticed. She woke up to alarms and ran to the next patient to repeat the cycle of endless care. She felt the money in her bank account dwindling, every bill a reminder that she had nothing left for herself. She missed meals, missed calls, missed letters from friends who worried about her, and the apartment she had lost was a symbol of everything slipping away. The city outside moved on. People carried on with their lives, unaware of the quiet battles being fought inside the hospital walls. She felt invisible, yet indispensable. Every life depended on her, and yet she felt powerless. She worked through the night helping a young boy struggling to breathe, his parents holding his hands as she administered treatment. She whispered that he was strong, that he could fight. And for a moment she saw hope in his eyes. But the reality was brutal. He worsened by dawn, and she held his hand until he drew his last breath, her heart breaking. Yet she immediately moved to the next patient. She could not pause. She could not fall apart. She was the lifeline for dozens of people. Every second counted. Every action mattered. She held her mother's hand as she stabilized her vitals, and the gratitude in her mother's eyes was a bittersweet reminder of why she continued. Yet she felt the crushing weight of exhaustion, the unrelenting pressure, the isolation from the world outside. The only people she saw were those in need of her care and those who depended on her expertise. And she longed for a single moment of relief, a single moment of peace. But there was none. She had given everything to the world, and the world had taken everything from her. She sat alone in a quiet corner of the hospital for a few minutes, trying to remember who she was before the pandemic, who she was before she lost everything. She felt the tears come freely for the first time in weeks. She let them fall, and she whispered the names of her father and the memories of her home, the images of her childhood, the feeling of safety and warmth. She had not realized how much she had missed it, how much she had needed it. The exhaustion hit her fully now, her body trembling, her mind foggy, yet she forced herself to stand, to return to the patients who needed her. She moved like a shadow through the night, her hands steady even as her heart felt shattered. She realized that she was on the edge of collapse, physically, emotionally, mentally. Yet she continued. She could not stop. There was too much at stake. The world depended on her, and she had to survive, even when survival seemed impossible. She was alone, yet not alone. She carried the lives of strangers in her hands. She had lost family, friends, comfort, money, stability, but she had purpose. She had the power to save lives. She had the ability to comfort the dying, to guide the frightened, to be a light in the darkness. And though it was heavy and painful and exhausting, she could not turn away. She had to continue because this was who she was, a doctor, a healer, a fighter. And even when the weight of the world threatened to crush her, she kept moving forward because giving up was not an option. Because even on the edge of collapse, she could still make a difference. Dr. Arifa Khan felt as if the weight of the entire world rested on her shoulders. Every day, every night, every moment was consumed by the hospital, the patients, the families, and the endless rhythm of monitors and alarms. She had lost track of time. Her mind blurred between day and night, her body screamed for rest, and her soul ached for comfort. Yet she could not stop. There were still lives depending on her hands. She moved from room to room, administering medication, checking vitals, adjusting treatments, and offering quiet words of hope, even when her own hope felt gone. The corridors of the hospital had become both her sanctuary and her prison. She rarely saw anyone who was not in need of help, rarely had a moment to herself, and rarely felt the warmth of a human touch that was not burdened by grief or fear. She sat alone in the break room for a few moments, her head in her hands, her knees aching, her body trembling. She had not eaten in over 24 hours. Her eyes stung with exhaustion. She felt a hollowness inside, a void that seemed to grow with every loss. She thought of her father and the finality of his absence. The grief cut deep, and she swallowed it back down because she could not afford to break. Not now, not ever. She thought of her mother in the hospital, fighting for her own life, and she felt helpless that she could not be at her side fully. She had to divide herself between dozens of patients, each needing her guidance, her touch, her presence, and yet her own family was slipping through her fingers. She stood and moved to the ICU, where the critically ill were kept. The machines beeped endlessly. The nurses moved quickly, trying to keep up with the unrelenting demand. And Arifa gave instructions, adjusted monitors, held hands, and whispered reassurances. She felt the tears threatening to fall, yet she could not allow them to escape. She could not let the patients see her weakness, even as the exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. She received a call from the hospital administration that the supply of essential medication was running low, that there would not be enough ventilators for all the patients. She felt panic rise in her chest, yet she forced herself to focus. She organized the team, prioritized patients, and searched for alternatives. She felt as if she was juggling life and death itself, and the responsibility crushed her. She walked to a patient struggling to breathe, a young woman with frightened eyes. She held her hand, adjusted her oxygen, and whispered that she was not alone, that she was strong, that she would survive, and she meant it even when she feared she might not save her. The day blurred into night, and the night into day. The hospital became a loop of endless care, of life and death, of hope and despair. She felt herself fraying at the edges, losing pieces of herself with each passing hour. She dreamed briefly of going home, of lying in her bed, of feeling warmth and safety and normalcy. But she knew that dream was gone, that she had nothing left for herself. No home, no money, no family to protect fully, no life outside the hospital walls. She helped a family deliver a baby, the mother exhausted and pale, the father holding his wife trembling with joy and fear. Arifa handed the baby to them and watched the moment of pure life fill the room, and she felt a spark of light in her chest, a reminder that her work mattered, that even in darkness there could be hope. She returned to her rounds and found a young nurse collapsing from exhaustion. She caught her shoulder, steadied her, whispered encouragement, and guided her to rest while she took over the patient care herself. She felt herself teetering on the edge of collapse, her knees weak, her vision blurry, yet she continued because there was no other option. Giving up was not allowed in a world where lives depended on her. She thought of the families she had comforted, the patients she had saved, the lives she had held in her hands, and the weight of all of it pressed down on her so heavily that she wondered how she could continue. She sat for a moment against the wall, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She allowed herself to feel the grief, the exhaustion, the loss. She whispered the names of her father, of her mother, of the patients who had passed, and the pain surged through her like a tidal wave. And then something shifted. She remembered why she had chosen this path. The passion, the promise, the reason she became a doctor, the desire to save lives, to make a difference, to stand when others could not. She drew in a deep breath and pushed herself to her feet. She wiped the tears from her face and returned to the patients. She moved through the hospital with renewed focus, even as her body begged for rest, even as her mind threatened to give out. She held hands, she offered reassurances, she administered treatments, and she whispered hope. She realized that even at her breaking point, she had the power to continue. Even in the darkest nights, she could be the light for others. Even when she felt empty, she could fill the hearts of those around her with courage and strength. She moved from patient to patient, and each small victory, each life saved, each hand held, reminded her that she had purpose, that she had meaning. And even as the world outside moved on, unaware of her sacrifices, she knew that she mattered, that she was needed, and that she could not stop, that she would not stop, because this was who she was, a doctor, a fighter, a healer. And even at the edge of despair, she could rise again and carry on. Dr. Arifa Khan walked through the hospital corridors, her steps slower than before, yet determined. She had felt the crushing weight of loss, the emptiness of isolation, the exhaustion of endless nights and days without sleep, without rest, without comfort. Yet now she held on to the small victories, the moments when she saw life win over death, the tiny sparks of hope that reminded her why she continued. She checked her patients one by one, adjusting medications, monitoring vitals, reassuring families, explaining procedures, and holding hands. She had learned to move with precision and calm, even when her own heart threatened to break. She saw the young boy she had feared losing last week, now sitting up in bed, smiling weakly at his mother, who held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. And Arifa felt a warmth bloom in her chest that she had not felt in months. She had saved him, and in that saving, she remembered her purpose. She walked to the ICU, where the critically ill were kept. The monitors beeped frantically, yet she moved with confidence, giving instructions, guiding nurses, adjusting ventilators, administering medication, and whispering quiet encouragement to those who could hear her. She felt the exhaustion pressing against her body, her muscles aching, her head pounding, yet she refused to stop. She had learned to pace herself, to find moments of strength in the briefest of pauses. A sip of water, a deep breath, a glance at the sunrise through the window of the hospital that reminded her there was a world outside and that she still had a place in it. She received a call from her mother's doctor, and her heart lifted. Her mother had stabilized, the medication was working, the oxygen levels were improving, and there was hope for her survival. Arifa felt tears fill her eyes, yet she swallowed them and focused on her rounds. She moved from patient to patient, noticing small improvements: a mother sitting up, feeding her child, a man walking slowly with a nurse's support, a young woman laughing weakly at a joke, her laughter fragile yet genuine. And these moments reminded Arifa that even in the darkest times, life found a way to persist. She sat with a patient recovering from a severe infection, holding her hand and listening to her tell stories about her family, her childhood, her dreams. And Arifa felt connection, a reminder that healing was not only physical but emotional, that her presence alone could bring comfort. She helped coordinate with other hospitals, sharing resources, expertise, advice, and guidance to save more lives. She began to see the fruits of her relentless work, the staff more coordinated, the patients improving, the hospital functioning more efficiently. And in that, she found a sense of accomplishment, a sense that her efforts mattered beyond her own exhaustion. She finally allowed herself small breaks, moments where she could close her eyes for a minute or two, sip warm tea, or sit quietly and breathe in the sterile air of the hospital. She knew she could not stay in this comfort long. There were still patients to care for, still lives at risk, still families waiting for hope. Yet she cherished the few moments where she could remember her own humanity. She helped deliver another baby, a healthy boy whose mother had struggled for weeks in the ICU. The cries of the newborn filled the room, and Arifa felt her chest swell with relief and joy. She wrapped the child carefully and handed him to the father, watching their tears of happiness and knowing she had given them this gift of life reminded her that every sacrifice had meaning. She coordinated with other doctors to implement better protocols to prevent loss and improve patient care. She began to see the fruits of her relentless work, the staff more coordinated, the patients improving, the hospital functioning more efficiently. And in that, she found a sense of accomplishment, a sense that her efforts mattered beyond her own exhaustion. She finally allowed herself small breaks, moments where she could close her eyes for a minute or two, sip warm tea, or sit quietly and breathe in the sterile air of the hospital. She knew she could not stay in this comfort long. There were still patients to care for, still lives at risk, still families waiting for hope. Yet she cherished the few moments where she could remember her own humanity. She helped deliver another baby, a healthy boy, whose mother had struggled for weeks in the ICU. The cries of the newborn filled the room, and Arifa felt her chest swell with relief and joy. She wrapped the child carefully and handed him to the father, watching their tears of happiness and knowing she had given them this gift of life reminded her that every sacrifice had meaning. She coordinated with other doctors to implement better protocols to prevent loss and improved patient care. She felt a surge of confidence seeing her plans take effect, seeing lives saved because of her knowledge, her guidance, her insistence on never giving up. She took time to write messages to families whose loved ones had passed, offering condolences, words of hope, and encouragement, reminding them that even in grief, they were not alone. She walked to the roof of the hospital one evening, looking at the city below, the lights twinkling. She allowed herself a moment to feel gratitude for still being here, for still having the ability to make a difference. She remembered her father, her mother, her losses, her grief, yet she realized that she had grown stronger, more resilient, more capable. She knew the storm was not over, the pandemic still raged, yet she had learned to navigate it, to endure it, to find hope in despair, to find light in darkness. She returned to the hospital floors, determined to continue. Every patient who smiled weakly, every family who expressed gratitude, every small improvement was a victory that fueled her spirit. She realized that even though she had lost almost everything, she still had purpose, she still had meaning, she still had the power to make a difference. She moved from room to room, hands steady, heart strong, eyes focused. And in that relentless determination, she found a renewed sense of strength, a sense that she could survive, that she could endure, that she could continue to help others even when the world seemed against her. She had begun to rebuild herself, slowly, steadily, carefully, each small victory a break in the foundation of her resilience. She realized that even when the pandemic had taken so much, she could still give life, hope, courage, and love, and that was more than enough to keep moving forward. Dr. Arifa Khan walked through the hospital halls, her steps steadier than they had been in months. She had endured the darkest nights of loss, grief, and exhaustion, yet now she felt a quiet strength building inside her. Each patient she helped, each life she touched, each small victory reminded her of why she had chosen this path. She checked the charts of patients in critical condition, adjusting treatments, giving instructions to nurses, monitoring vitals, and guiding families through moments of fear and uncertainty. She had learned to anticipate needs, to act quickly, to provide comfort, and to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Her presence had become a source of reassurance for both patients and staff. She coordinated with other doctors to organize resources, ensure medications were available, and implement protocols that minimized risk. She found herself mentoring younger staff, sharing knowledge, giving encouragement, and instilling confidence. She had become not only a healer, but a leader, a guide, and a symbol of resilience. The city outside was still grappling with the pandemic, but inside the hospital, a sense of controlled chaos had emerged thanks to her tireless efforts. She moved to the ICU, where patients were most vulnerable, checking machines, adjusting ventilators, monitoring oxygen levels, and whispering words of hope to those who could hear her. She held hands with the critically ill, offering comfort and strength. She watched as some stabilized, improving slowly under the care of her team, and she felt the surge of pride and relief, knowing that her guidance had made the difference. She spent moments with recovering patients, listening to their stories, laughing softly at their jokes, and offering encouragement, reminding them that even in the darkest times, there was hope. She organized support groups for families whose loved ones had passed, helping them cope with grief, sharing with them the stories of survival and care, showing them that their loved ones had not suffered in silence. She coordinated with other hospitals, sharing insights on treatment protocols, resource management, and patient care, creating a network that allowed more lives to be saved. She felt a sense of control returning, a sense that she could influence outcomes and make a difference beyond her immediate reach. She helped stabilize a young woman whose condition had worsened despite weeks of treatment. Her hands steady, her voice calm, her instructions precise, and her determination unwavering. She guided the team through a critical procedure, and the patient survived. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that her knowledge, skill, and perseverance had changed the course of a life. She returned to the regular wards, checking on patients who were recovering, encouraging those who were fearful, and comforting those who had lost hope. She found moments to rest in quiet corners, sips of water, warm tea, brief minutes of reflection where she allowed herself to feel the emotions she had suppressed for so long. She remembered her father and felt grief, yet she also remembered his strength and the values he had instilled in her. She thought of her mother, whose condition had improved, and she felt gratitude for the chance to continue caring for her. She began to reconnect with colleagues and friends she had neglected during the months of unrelenting work, sharing experiences, offering support, and receiving comfort in return. She realized that even though she had lost so much, she was not alone. She had built a new network of connection through her work, through the patients she had helped, through the lives she had touched. She held workshops for staff on coping with trauma, burnout, and grief, sharing her own experiences, guiding them to find resilience and strength in adversity. She became a mentor, a leader, a source of hope for others navigating the same storm. She saw the first signs of recovery in the hospital system, the number of patients slowly decreasing, resources stabilizing, staff less overwhelmed, and she knew her efforts were paying off. She organized community outreach programs, offering guidance on safety, hygiene, and mental health. She spoke on panels, shared experiences with other doctors and healthcare workers, becoming a voice for those who were struggling. She realized that even though she had lost her home, her father, and much of her previous life, she had gained purpose, connection, influence, and the ability to save and improve lives on a scale she had never imagined. She walked to the roof one evening, looking at the city lights twinkling in the distance. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel gratitude for surviving, to feel pride for enduring, to feel hope for the future. She promised herself silently that she would continue to fight, continue to heal, continue to help, continue to lead. She realized that control was not about preventing loss. It was about influencing outcomes, maximizing survival, and giving hope, even in the darkest times. She returned to the wards with renewed determination, energy, and focus, ready to face the remaining challenges with strength, compassion, and resilience. She had reclaimed control, not over the pandemic, not over fate, not over death, but over her own spirit, her own purpose, and her capacity to make a difference. And in that reclamation, she found freedom, power, and the courage to continue even when the world seemed uncertain, because she was Dr. Arifa Khan, a doctor, a healer, a fighter, and even in the face of adversity, she would continue to rise and guide and save. Dr. Arifa Khan walked through the hospital halls, her steps steady, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The nights of grief, exhaustion, and despair had not disappeared, but she had learned to carry them with strength and purpose. Each patient she cared for, each life she touched, each family she comforted, reminded her of why she continued. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of loss, finding resilience, courage, and determination in the process. She checked on patients whose conditions had stabilized, offering encouragement, guiding them through recovery, and celebrating small victories. She walked to the ICU where she oversaw critical care, ensuring protocols were followed, monitoring equipment, guiding staff, and offering calm reassurance to families. Her leadership had transformed the hospital into a place of hope amid chaos. She received messages from families of patients she had saved, gratitude, words that made her heart swell and reminded her that her sacrifices had meaning. She found herself mentoring younger doctors and nurses, sharing lessons learned during the pandemic, teaching them how to manage stress, cope with trauma, and find strength in adversity. She realized that even in her darkest moments, she had grown capable of guiding others, giving them tools to survive and thrive. She began organizing community health programs, teaching people about hygiene, safety, and mental health. She spoke at panels, shared her experiences, and became a voice of hope and resilience for those navigating the challenges of the pandemic. The city was slowly recovering. New patients were fewer, staff less overwhelmed, resources stabilized, and she saw the tangible results of her relentless efforts. She helped develop outreach programs to support families who had lost loved ones, offering counseling and emotional support. She visited them herself, sometimes sitting quietly, listening to their stories, offering comfort and understanding. She realized that even though she had lost her father and endured immense grief, she had created a legacy of care and compassion that extended far beyond her own family. She found herself reconnecting with old friends, colleagues, and neighbors, rebuilding relationships she had neglected during the months of unrelenting work, and she discovered that even amid loss and hardship, human connection could be restored. She took moments to reflect on her journey, the long nights, the endless rounds, the patients she had saved, and those she had lost. She acknowledged her grief, allowed herself to cry for her father and the life she had lost. Yet she did not let it define her. She had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable. She finally returned to her small apartment, now repaired and safe. She unpacked her few belongings and felt a sense of home returning. She realized that home was no longer just a place. It was the strength she carried inside. It was the resilience she had built. It was the purpose she had reclaimed. She continued to care for patients with renewed vigor and focus. She organized workshops for hospital staff and community members, helping them develop coping strategies for trauma, burnout, and grief. She became a beacon of hope, a symbol of endurance and compassion. She saw the results of her efforts in the improved health of patients, in the gratitude of families, in the confidence and capability of younger staff. She had transformed tragedy into purpose, loss into resilience, despair into hope. She reflected on the months of chaos and realized that she had survived because she had held on to her purpose, and she had used her grief as a tool to fuel compassion. She reached out to other hospitals and healthcare systems, sharing her experiences, protocols, and lessons learned, creating a network of knowledge that would save countless lives. She began speaking publicly about the challenges healthcare workers faced during the pandemic, the sacrifices they made, and the support they needed, becoming a voice for those who had given everything and had no one to advocate for them. She moved through the hospital with renewed energy and determination. Every patient, every family, every staff member felt her presence, her guidance, her unwavering commitment to life. She realized that even though she had lost so much, she had gained a new life, a new purpose, a new way to make a difference. She had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, from the ruins of despair and grief. She walked to the roof one evening, looking out at the city below, the lights sparkling like stars. She allowed herself to feel pride, gratitude, and hope. She promised herself silently that she would continue to fight, continue to heal, continue to guide and save. She realized that the world might never be the same, yet she could still shape the lives around her through compassion, courage, and determination. She had become more than a doctor. She had become a leader, a mentor, a voice, a symbol of resilience. And she knew that even in the face of future challenges, she could endure because she had survived the unimaginable and emerged stronger, wiser, and filled with purpose. Dr. Arifa Khan walked through the hospital halls with a calm confidence that had been forged through months of trial, suffering, and relentless effort. She had endured grief, exhaustion, and loss, yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than she had ever imagined. Each patient she cared for, each life she touched, each family she comforted, reminded her that her sacrifices had meaning and that her work mattered. She moved to the ICU to check on critical patients, monitoring vitals, adjusting equipment, guiding staff, and offering quiet reassurance to those who could hear her voice. She held the hands of the frightened, the weak, and the recovering, speaking words of hope, strength, and courage. She had become a pillar of stability, a source of knowledge, and a symbol of resilience in the hospital. She organized training sessions, workshops, and mentoring programs for doctors and nurses, teaching them not only medical skills, but also how to cope with trauma, stress, and loss. She shared her personal experiences, the nights she had spent exhausted in hospital corridors, the patients she had lost, and the moments she had saved. And she showed them that even in the darkest times, one could endure, survive, and lead. She coordinated community outreach programs, educating families on hygiene, safety, and mental health. She worked with local organizations to ensure resources reached those in need, and she became a voice advocating for healthcare workers, highlighting their sacrifices, struggles, and needs to the world. She saw the tangible results of her efforts: patients recovering more quickly, staff functioning more effectively, families feeling supported, and communities benefiting from her guidance. And she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her work had created lasting impact. She visited families who had lost loved ones, sitting with them, listening to their stories, and offering comfort and reassurance. She had become a bridge between life and death, a source of hope and strength for those navigating unimaginable grief. She reflected on the losses she had endured: her father, her home, her peace, her previous life, and she allowed herself to mourn. Yet she did not let grief consume her. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of despair. She had created a new life defined not by what she had lost, but by what she had accomplished. She walked through the wards, checking on recovering patients, offering encouragement, celebrating small victories, and reminding them that life was precious, fragile, and yet resilient. She had learned that even in suffering, there could be hope. Even in exhaustion, there could be strength. Even in loss, there could be purpose. She began writing a book, sharing her experiences, lessons learned, and insights from the pandemic. She wanted to give a voice to the invisible struggles of healthcare workers and inspire others to find courage in adversity. She spoke at conferences, panels, and interviews, sharing knowledge, advocating for support for medical professionals, and highlighting the importance of resilience and compassion in care. She built a network of healthcare workers across hospitals and communities, exchanging knowledge, resources, and encouragement. She realized that her impact extended far beyond her immediate environment, that her perseverance and dedication had inspired countless others to continue their work and to find strength in their own challenges. She finally returned to her repaired apartment, arranging her simple belongings and feeling a sense of home returning. She realized that home was not only a place, it was a state of being. It was the strength she carried inside, the purpose she embraced, and the connections she had nurtured. She visited her mother, whose health had fully recovered, and they shared quiet moments of love, understanding, and reconciliation. She held her mother's hand and allowed herself to feel gratitude, relief, and hope. She knew that while the scars of loss would remain, they would not define her future. She continued to lead her hospital with calm confidence, guiding staff, mentoring young doctors and nurses, and ensuring that patient care remained compassionate and effective. She moved through the city, speaking to the community, sharing guidance, reassurance, and hope. She had become a symbol of endurance, strength, and dedication. She reflected on the months of struggle, the long nights, the endless patience, the grief and exhaustion, and she recognized that she had survived because she had clung to purpose, she had embraced responsibility, and she had refused to surrender to despair. She had transformed tragedy into resilience, loss into purpose, and exhaustion into strength. She walked to the roof one evening, looking at the city lights sparkling like stars, and allowed herself to feel pride, accomplishment, and hope. She promised silently that she would continue to fight, continue to heal, continue to guide, and continue to inspire. She realized that her journey was far from over, that challenges would come, yet she had the courage, the wisdom, and the strength to face them. She had become more than a doctor. She had become a leader, a mentor, a voice, a symbol, and a living testament that even when life takes everything from you, it is possible to rise, rebuild, and create meaning and purpose. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool night air, feeling at peace with herself and her journey, knowing that she had endured the unimaginable and emerged not only intact, but transformed into a force for life, hope, and resilience. She opened her eyes and looked at the city below. She had lost almost everything, yet she had gained so much more. She had gained strength, courage, compassion, and the power to make a difference. She smiled quietly, knowing that her story would continue in every life she touched, every mind she inspired, and every heart she comforted. She was Dr. Arifa Khan, a healer, a fighter, a leader, a survivor, and her legacy was just beginning.